Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groos and my guest today is Jasper Bernes. Jasper is an author, managing editor at Commune magazine and lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley. He recently published a very interesting article titled Planning and Anarchy, which will be at the center of our discussion today. I very much enjoyed talking to Jasper, I have to say, as well as reading his text, and I want to encourage all of you to read it too. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to Jasper is that I wanted to find out if there is room for a synthesis between what he describes as planarchy and another approach towards planning that has been discussed in Future Histories quite prominently, namely that of Daniel E. Saros, author of Information Technology and Socialist Construction, The End of Capital and the Transition to Socialism, who I had the pleasure of welcoming as a guest in double episode 31 and 32. I personally believe, and you will hear this throughout this episode, that Jasper's and Dan's approaches complement each other quite well, actually, precisely because they are so different in character. Jasper describes planarchy as, and I quote here, an organization of human activity that accepts the fundamentally self-directed, spontaneous and creative character of human action, end quote. And while he correctly points out that this is fundamentally incompatible with central planning, I think that the bottom-up type of approach that Daniel E. Saros puts forward has at least some elements in it that can be fruitfully merged with an idea of planarchy as Jasper describes it. But hear for yourself and let me know what you think about all of this. You can write me via jan@futurehistories.today or comment in the Future Histories subreddit or on Twitter. And if you're interested in the topic in general, then please check out the show notes because there is a lot of material in there surrounding the question of contemporary planning. For example, I did a double episode with Benjamin Bratton as well, in which we discussed the idea of a platform of platforms. And I recently published an article in English language on the topic in the Behemoth journal special edition Futures of Critique, Theorizing Governmentality and Power in the Digital Age. You'll find all of this in the show notes. And before we start, I'd like to thank Friederike, Fabian, Veronika and Joachim for their kind donations. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Jasper Bernes on planning and anarchy. Welcome, Jasper.
Well, thank you for having me.
Even though the planning debate has been a prominent topic of Future Histories, and I think many of our listeners will be familiar with the outlines of the discourse, there might be a few who are not. So maybe you could give us a quick overview of the contemporary version of the planning debate and your main critique of it.
Well, that's something of a difficult task. Of course, planning has been at the center of discussions about any transition out of capitalism since the 19th century, and all revolutionaries in the 19th century envisioned some sort of planning as being the basis for a future human society that was classless, moneyless, or stateless. But I think that there's a number of different meanings embedded within the concept of planning. And I think for most of the 20th century, planning was associated with a certain particular kind of planning, central planning, and the problems associated with that. In particular, the economy of the Soviet Union and what it could or could not do and did or did not do sort of comes to the center of these debates, and particularly, an argument about the possibility of replicating the market through planning, what's called the so-called socialist calculation debate. And in many ways, this was an interesting and an important debate, but it had the effect of conflating planning itself with certain mathematical problems of calculation that really don't exhaust the meanings or the issues involved in planning, and I would argue are actually sort of extrinsic to them. But the received history of these debates is that essentially the problem with planning as it was conceived in socialism in the 20th century was that planners lacked a certain kind of information and lacked a certain kind of processing power. Planners in the Soviet Union didn't know where goods were or what kinds of goods existed or what people wanted, but they also didn't have the kind of mathematical and computational power to organize that information. So fast forward 80 years, now as people have a renewed interest in socialism and in the history of the left, the communist left, the socialist left, the anarchist left, they've returned to these kinds of debates with an eye to how present technological capacities and organizational capacities might change them. And there was almost a consensus in contemporary literature that somehow today, while planners in the early 20th century confronted these sort of insuperable problems of recording, processing, and calculating information, now contemporary information technology has mooted those problems. And in fact, also that the current structure of capitalism is already partially planned, that you can look at these mega corporations like Amazon or Walmart and see within them a kind of planning and a form of calculation and rationality that is in fact adequate to the construction of socialism. And I think this is entirely wrong for a number of reasons. The first is that I think that planning never was and is not a question primarily of calculation or information, though calculation and information might nonetheless be very important to planning. And then when you look at these corporations, in fact, they assume the market and production for profit. In fact, do not plan much of what they do, and in fact, enforce the kind of unplanned distribution of resources on the rest of the economy, and they depend upon it. It wouldn't be possible to be Walmart or Amazon if the economy wasn't already structured by the kind of chaotic volatility of the capitalist marketplace and the way that it distributes goods and capital. So, I guess I've launched a number of attacks on this particular way of understanding planning, but my goal is to actually open up the horizon of what's possible within a kind of revolutionary transformation of society and conceive of planning on a really different basis and suggest that there are in fact many types of planning and that the kinds of questions that will face people trying to overthrow capitalism and construct something new in its place are rather different than they have been construed.
Could you maybe dig a little deeper into the question of different types of planning? Because you already hinted that the types of planning that we see at Amazon, Walmart, or the Pentagon, that these examples of large-scale planning that are often being brought up in the contemporary planning debate, that this is not the type of planning that we should aim for. And therefore, this idea of taking these examples as examples for the possibility of a socialist mode of planning is kind of misleading. And as an opposite, you bring up a conception of planning that you derive from Marx, where you say that planning in and as communism would mean something entirely different. Could you maybe get a little bit deeper into this difference between planning in and as communism and the types of planning that we see today?
Well, first off, I would say that planning is everywhere within human society, and humans have always planned. Humans have always labored in a way where they have an eye toward the future, and they undertake complicated sequences of tasks with particular time signatures. And you need to do that in order to survive and meet the challenges of a kind of chaotic and volatile environment. So it's not a question of planning or not. And of course, therefore, governments plan, corporations plan, families plan. There's planning everywhere, right? Activity is not simply kind of immediate and, reactive, right? Because of the nature of how humans interact with each other. So, that's the first thing. But so what is it that a company like Amazon or Walmart does within our society? And what kinds of planning do they undertake? Well, what they do is they control the distribution of products in such a way that they're able to enforce certain kinds of norms on their producers, and they can make money. But they don't care anything about the producers, right? And in fact, they have to, in order to make money, they're constantly being able to shift from one producer to another to find the cheapest labor. And that requires that there's variability in costs for each of those suppliers. It requires that there's kind of chaos in the industries that supply those producers. That's the only way that Walmart and Amazon and these companies can make money. And more specifically, the whole logistics system, which is kind of allowed for contract production at a global scale, is oriented towards finding the cheapest sources of labor in the world. And if I were to give you, imagine a thought experiment in which we immediately equalized wages, none of that would be rational or make any sense. You're only kind of producing at such scale in order to kind of massively hyper exploit workers. And there would be no reason to produce things and ship them across the world so many times, with the exception of some, very rare types of inputs. So in what sense could that be said to be useful? These companies don't actually aggregate the kinds of information that we're interested in. They don't really record meaningful preferences and demands because they're oriented only towards producing what is profitable, not necessarily what is needed. Now, they may have some techniques and some systems and some ways of working with information that could be useful. People talk about, the way that they transmit, real-time information about consumption and things that are being sold right at the moment. And, perhaps, and so in that way, they're able to avoid having the buildup of stocks. And, perhaps that kind of transmission of information would be very useful in the future, but that's a small part of really what they do. And it's not what structures their operations. So, I think that to say that the basis of anything is really quite ridiculous.
What I really liked about this this part of your text is that you pointed at what a different type of planning could succeed in. And you state that in Marx's presentation, planning answers both epistemological and practical questions at once. It allows you both to know and to do, to see and control. But this does not mean that transparency, removal of the commodity veil, automatically implies tractability, nor vice versa. And I really like that, actually, because there you can see that one doesn't come out of the other and that we should actually take care of both of it. And that's what I liked about your critique towards this centralized planned economies, that they might succeed in like collecting some sorts of information, but that this does not at all mean that they will succeed in the question of control, which is finally the question of politics, and that this is something that needs to be answered at its core and is arguably one of the more difficult tasks if you look at the question of planning.
Absolutely. And I think this really is where it's important to talk specifically about what capitalism is and how it does what it does in order to contrast it to communism and the things that we would want from some kind of system or society. And in capitalism, the market and prices and wages and profits are all ways of distributing capital and labor through branches of production, right? Capital moves in and out of particular lines in order to produce things that are profitable and, therefore incidentally meets human needs. But labor also needs to move in and out of those lines, right? And so capitalism has a system for doing that by dispossessing people and forcing them to sell their labor. And so people trying to kind of earn the best wage or just earn any wage at all move in and out of the economy. And therefore, there's this kind of distribution of labor. But that means that if we imagine a society of freely associated producers working with the means of production held in common, you can't simply assume that prices and profits are going to just shift people around. They'll be at the whim of these kinds of abstractions, right? On the other hand, people have to be freely choosing how to organize their lives and how to move themselves and things around. And unfortunately, I think most planning models still assume that humans will be moved around by prices and various kinds of indicators. And I would say that's even true of, I know I read an article you wrote, that talks about a very interesting book by Daniel Saros. And I would say it's also true, of his way of thinking about socialist laws of motion. But I think that's very different than how Marx conceived of communism or socialism, which he conceives of a system in which, freely associated workers both understand what they're doing. They're working with kind of self-awareness or self-consciousness, but are also able to affect it. And that means that, communism must be an open book. It must, the knowledge and information can't be kind of held only in particular hands. It must be available to all. But also, it must be changeable, right? It must be something that people can, where people can reorganize what they have in response to changing conditions or in order to improve their lives. So that's, those are a set of requirements that I think take you on a really different path than the way planning is often conceived.
You propose a very different mode of engaging with the question of planning, and you call it Planarchy. Could you maybe explain a bit what you mean by Planarchy?
Well, I think this is a concept that I propose to cover a somewhat broad and undefined vision of communist society that I certainly haven't fully worked out, and I don't think that I need to. I think that what matters really are kind of setting out some sort of principles and logical guidelines, and then speculating about the kinds of various ways and also the issues that such a system might confront. But if you imagine, that production or reproduction or the kind of management of people's lives and development is both tractable and transparent, right? That people are able to participate in the decisions that matter for them. That labor is both voluntary, and that also access to social wealth is free. then that, establishes certain requirements for how things will be conducted. And so, necessarily, production would have to be both distributed, but also coordinated. And I think the best way is to imagine that there's a fair amount of redundancy built in. I think that most systems of planning imagine that you want to run everything as taut as possible in order to kind of maximize efficiency. But a certain kind of inefficiency and a certain kind of duplication of effort may be desirable because it allows for a kind of autonomy and flexibility and resilience. And so, I mean, so in general, I think when we approach thinking about communism, it's probably best not to start from planning itself, but to imagine, what a revolution would require, how things could be changed, and what kinds of measures people might take, because of course, it's a process. So, I think that that's work that I'm trying to do in writing that I'm working on now. But I think that the most important thing that I've been trying to point out is that most of these planning proposals assume as their basis, and they often don't remark on it very much, a kind of obligation to labor, right? They assume that that in order to consume some part of the social product, you have to labor. But then they put in this proviso that those who cannot labor need to be provided for. And of course, society always does this. We provide for children. We provide for people after they've worked, and that's a requirement. But there are a number of problems that result from assuming this is your axiom. And I've tried to kind of explore some of them. One I would just say is that it requires a kind of social judgment. This is the first approach that I think is somewhat separate than the planning question, but it requires a social judgment about who can labor and who can't. That I think is extraordinarily problematic, and it's dependent on kind of concept of ability and disability that I think is going to be extraordinarily difficult to implement. And also, I think that when you individualize reward, as is required for that system, it introduces all kinds of problems. And it's really, it's actually really unnecessary because a communist revolution could immediately communalize or socialize most of what people need: food, housing, education. All of that could be provided free and on access and sort of taken out of the market. And there would be no need to really kind of like individually meter people's access. Perhaps certain rare, certain goods you couldn't organize like that. But I think that individually metering people's access to basic necessities is almost regressive, and it would require a kind of administration that would produce such negative consequences and so much kind of dissonance within society that it would certainly be far worse than any benefits it produces. So I think you just have to start with the fact that labor is going to be voluntary. And there's a number of other kind of argumentative approaches I could take to show you why that has to be the case. But this is also Marx's assumption, that whenever he's talking about communism, he says, we assume here, that the producers do not exchange their goods, that this is, a free association of workers. You have to start from that basis of freedom. And it's going to be fundamentally contradicted if you're forcing people into the workplace. And to just give you one example of one of the problems that this creates is that if you look at the Soviet Union, people tend to think that workers there were kind of constantly hectored and exploited and, managed on the work site, and this was true. But in fact, the problem with the Soviet economy is that workers had too much power, not too little. Managers were entirely unable to get them to work or to work with any kind of quality. And you can see why this is it's very obvious if you just think about it for a second. If in socialism, labor is an obligation, then you can't really fire somebody without putting them somewhere else. And this contradiction between labor that is both sort of an obligation and then the incentives that it produces is, almost insuperable, because you can't actually really get rid of workers who aren't doing anything because they have to work somewhere. And so it actually is, the whole idea is dependent upon a notion of incentive that it's unable to actually produce. And that's why, most mechanisms have to come in with some kind of alternate system of incentive, of differential incentive, because they recognize that it fundamentally isn't a motor. And so, I think that most of these discussions just are wrong-footed from the start. So
I do absolutely agree with this problem of forcing people to work. I absolutely hate this aspect in all of these proposals that I put out there. And I very much learned this from Stefan Meretz and Simon Sutterlity's book about communism from Commons, actually, and from your article as well. And I think this is a very, very crucial point. Nonetheless, I am very much interested in not stopping there, because if we take a very good look at, for example, the proposal put out there by Daniel E. Saros, and we can see that he has this misconception of forcing people to labor or these for me, very crude mechanisms of incentivization and punishment, which I do not agree with. I'm asking myself if some of these mechanisms he describes are nonetheless useful in building up what you point to as a question of control. Because when you describe this approach towards Planarchy, I absolutely agree with all of your premises, actually, but I am left with a huge question mark in terms of how to actually achieve this. And then you either come to the question of transformation, which you hinted towards, and then it's a very, very, very procedural type of thinking, where you think, okay, we will have to figure things out along the way. Or you open up the space for some kind of imaginative approach that is quasi-utopian, but without resorting to these modes of punishment, this pressure to labor and stuff like that. Because I think we need to have some kind of idea on how to organize these like hard questions of economic organization. And if not for practical reasons, then for the sake of convincing other people to go along with us on this road.
That's very persuasive, and I agree with you in the sense that I read these proposals with great interest, and I'm always sort of looking for the part of it that's really about planning and coordination of activity, independent of these assumptions about the basic fundamentals of communism or socialism. So, for instance, within Saros's book, there's much that's quite interesting, and I think that that comes from a kind of dialogue with the Paracon model, but certainly when when you imagine these different kinds of workplaces or councils that are choosing between techniques and inputs, and then also trying to meet particular requests, I think that the sort of information clearinghouse model that he offers, something like that makes a lot of sense. But what it doesn't, but then if you strip that from the structures of incentive and motion that it assumes, it's unclear what's left. And a lot of things, a lot of important things in that model are simply left undetermined: long-term planning. And if you think about communism as coming into a world that is ravaged by climate change, in which populations are shifting around the planet, in which there's some revolutionary process, I think that there's a sort of a set of assumptions or a starting point in much of this planning literature that kind of assumes a static equilibrium between workplaces that just won't exist. And so for that reason, I think you do have to be just quite suspicious of their applicability. I mean, one assumption that I want to really point out that Marx makes in some of his attempts to kind of debunk various socialist utopias is that if you assume these workers' councils sort of come into being, working with means of production which are very different in terms of their productivity, everything falls apart, and you can't really rate effort, and you establish these incredible inequalities between workplaces, which are probably going to have to do with scale, and you're going to have to do with kind of the way that the residues of capitalism are geographically embedded. And that's just a huge problem. It assumes that everybody's working with means of production that are at the average level of productivity, right? And they can therefore distinguish between effort and what the machines are giving you, but you won't be able to. And so it's going to be quite difficult for producers to make decisions in that kind of situation. And so this is where I think the vision of communism as processual and procedural is sort of unavoidable, even if we don't like it. And that's because the capitalism that we inherit will have these problems baked into the distribution of the means of production into particular branches that are located in particular kinds of places. And that's going to produce deep imbalances. That the division of labor is actually inscribed in the countryside and inscribed into kind of geographical regions. And we have to overcome this through a redistribution of the entire apparatus of production. And so therefore the assumption of, beginning from statics in these kinds of councils might not be very helpful, even though I think that you will still have to have production broken down into various kinds of units, but they will need to be, people will need to be probably much more mobile between them, and the forms of coordination will in fact be more extensive and be more about kind of remaking these kinds of inequalities, and also dealing with the mitigating climate change.
I'm actually not quite sure if I either do not follow or if we are talking about kind of different things, because I mean, Saros has this like phase 1, phase 2 type of idea in which he proposes a phase 1 in which you actually still have labor and you get credits for it and stuff like that. All the things we just rejected, basically. And then he has the phase 2, which he labels the communist phase, in which you would not have this coupling of labor and credits. And so I think what I am asking myself is, because you said what is left then? What is left then is some kind of meta platform that serves some kind of coordination purpose. And I think this will be needed in some type of fashion. And I think this might be something that we can take along from this proposal. And I do think that it has quite some dynamism baked into it as well, because I'm not quite sure if I understand you correctly when you speak about static assumptions in terms of these worker councils, because I do see these static conceptions within the centralized models of planned economies, in which they kind of try to compute a perfect plan and then let it be enacted by all of us, which I think is horrible. But within this model that Saros describes, there's actually quite some room for dynamism, quite some room for change, and for change that is coming bottom up and not top down. And this is what I actually like about it. And this is why I think it actually kind of attaches neatly to quite some of the things that you are arguing for, and which I believe to be quite compatible with some of the elements of socialist laws of motion that he tries to describe.
Well, I agree that we want to think dynamically, and that it does do that. It provides, a certain limited set of dynamics, but I actually think that the dynamics it selects are not really desirable and not functional in the kinds of situations that would be inherited. So I'll be even more specific, right? There is this baked into the system is this compulsion to improve technique, right? Under the threat that your workers' council might be outmoded and its products no longer selected because they aren't being produced with correct technique. But if you imagine, as I said, that these workers' councils are inheriting vastly different means of production, and the dynamic that distributes resources from one workers' council to another is partly sort of managed by the incentive of workers trying to leave unproductive ones and get into better ones that have better terms. I think it would actually, in fact, be quite destabilizing to construct things on the basis of those laws of motion. So I think we should think from dynamics, but I think that if we actually really think about, if we actually develop real laws of motion that would apply in that situation, we're going to have very different outcomes. So, but again, if we started from different principles, like labor is voluntary, then perhaps the dynamic would be different. But you'd no longer have those motions, because the incentive structure would be entirely different, right? So we'd have to think differently about why people would go from one line to another, or why people would switch. And I think actually I've become increasingly critical of some element of the notion of council, particularly because I think it tends to depend upon a notion of kind of right and property that's residual, that workers have a certain kind of right to the things that and control over the things that they immediately have access to. And I think that that's in fact problematic in some respects, and simply not true, because production is, and common. And one needs to think about how people might circulate through the entirety of the society to really create the sense of common belonging, that everything belongs to everyone, in order to, so that the free development of each really is the free development of all. And I think that's where Saros's plan is really inadequate, right? So for instance, it tries to equalize good and bad tasks. That happens only inside the workplace, which is entirely inadequate. The equalization of types of labor would have to take place on a society-wide basis, not within a single workplace. And so I think that the idea that you would be sort of almost bound to your location in Saros would be very problematic, and I think simply inapplicable with people who are subjectivized as we are, but also under the conditions inherited in a kind of modern society going through revolution. So, but I do think nonetheless, like self-organization by council and by formation of groups that control their own affairs is nonetheless the basis on which communism must be produced and conducted. But how they relate to each other, I think, is an open question and something that we might need to conceive on just a very different basis. So I think that we need to be able to think of people's right, as it were, to go somewhere else as much as, their right to belong. And so I'd like to see a vision of planning that took that into account.
Yeah, I find myself agreeing with you like nearly all of the time, I have to say, even though I'm also having like huge question marks afterwards. I mean, one of the things is that I want to state clearly that I absolutely agree that if anything is taken from the proposal that Saros describes, then it would have to be on the basis of everybody's needs are covered nonetheless. So I just want to make this clear that if anything, we should not start from what he calls phase one, but start from what he calls phase two, which would have this precondition that you would have like everybody's basic needs covered.
Yeah. So what's the rational kernel then? And I think it's like this idea of the general catalog in a way, which is that the kind of rational kernel of.
Well, I mean, that's to me. It's totally interesting that you keep coming back to this, because this is an open question nonetheless. This is an open question in Planarchy as it is in this case. So I absolutely agree. But still, the thing that you can take with you from this is that you would have some kind of meta platform or a principle of organization that you could apply to a political economy in which the needs of everybody are covered no matter what. And then you start from there, and you will still need to have some kind of organizing principle. And I do agree that it's wrong to use some kind of like labor punishment to make people do what you think that they should do. But if you skip this, then this will be an open question either way, in Planarchy or in this case.
So, okay, well, let's be more specific. Yeah. So I think that as a technical proposal, at the heart of that book is this idea of the general catalog, right? Where producers both survey needs and see how they can meet them, and also survey inputs and try to kind of plan in that way. And I think that that's fine. And that kind of Wikipedia production is probably going to be quite useful, even if the process is more iterative than imagined and less governed by algorithm as such. Because I think that there are a lot of constants that need to be decided by planners in that system that are sort of assumed, and those might actually have to be laid open and made tractable. But nonetheless, I think that idea of utilizing information techniques to both see what people want and see what's available is, of course, that's would be the basis. I think that we would want to get rid of a lot of the individualization that is in there. And so I think that if you imagine it seems silly to imagine that the basis of consumption is individuals ranking their preferences. I think that communism would, by necessity, in a revolutionary situation, communalize and communize much of reproduction, so food and housing, all of that. You wouldn't require people to order it individually. It would be sort of ordered by communities, right? And then people would be fed and provided for directly. And there could still be personal, and of course, there would need to be some personalization, and so certain rare things would have to be accounted for and recorded by those communities and then requested. And I think ordering would probably happen on a collective basis, and it would pass through different kinds of levels. And then so those consumption communes would then communicate their information. But a lot of production might simply be taken out of that and so localized that it's like people have their own gardens, they're producing things locally. So much stuff could be simply, not even require that kind of accounting and administration. And so, so there would definitely need to be coordination and calculation in between different kinds of geographical units, and that people need to be able to pass in between them. But they would also need to be able to coordinate on really, infrastructural kinds of plans of common interest, and that's where. But I think that's going to be less guided by equations and more guided by, essentially open-ended deliberation. And I think we also have to imagine the possibility of divergent futures as being desirable in some sense and allowing for kind of difference and for contradictions to be resolved by, allowing different people to do different things. I think that, communism will be about diversity of opportunity and access to resources to do things that none of us could even imagine. And so, I think that that's where the changeability comes in. So we want mechanisms for all of that. One of the things I like about some of the planning literature, especially like the stuff that's more influenced by the sort of Austrian tradition, like Jim Devine, is its emphasis on, what a kind of communist entrepreneurship, which sounds gross in one way, but in another sense, it touches on something really important, which is that freedom requires us to be able to do something completely new and have access to resources to do whatever. And I think to be able to fuck off and do nothing too. And, and that's one of the problems of the static assumption. So if that's what we get from Hayek, fine. I think that's actually in accord with Marx's notion of freedom. And that's where kind of binding people to workers' councils and imagining that is insufficient in some sense. And so yeah, I think that we and there'll have to be mechanisms for that, mechanisms for allocating resources to tasks that haven't been imagined. And that's where, Saros imagines that producers will invent new needs, but why, right?
No. They won't produce new needs.
They list new needs, and then they list new needs.
They don't list new needs. New product. Yeah, that's this type of entrepreneurship that you're talking about. And if it's based on top of a political economy where everybody's needs on a basic level are covered, then you would have this kind of creative construction that I think you're also talking about with reference to the Austrians. Because then, and this is a mechanism for the allocation of resources towards this kind of socialist entrepreneurship as well,
But you lock it within the council. Why would you necessarily?
I don't get the locking into.
Restrict that to an existing councils rather than just allowing anybody to access.
Maybe we have a different type of idea about these councils. What do you mean by locking into councils? I don't.
Well, it's the councils themselves. Only a council can list a new product.
Yeah, so but two people can be a council, actually.
Really, anybody can be a council?
Well, I asked Sarah in the interview, and I mean, it depends on what, which kind of phase we're talking about, of course, because that's the essential differentiation. Yeah. So, in the first phase, then it would have to have some kind of size in terms of production in order to be eligible to receive what you kind of can see as a base income,
That makes sense.
And in the second phase, it's totally up for everybody to decide. It's just a mechanism to bring forward this kind of, as I said, creative construction, so to speak, where you can present some kind of new approach towards this and that. And if people are interested, then it's kind of a matchmaking type of thing, as I see it somehow,
Right. My sense is that the dynamics would make the councils fairly conservative in their approaches, and that they would probably tend to not. It would seem to discourage that, and which may be fine. I don't necessarily, I think that a lot of this idea of the new in terms of product is a product of capitalism, and really not where development in communism is likely to appear to us as immaterial in many respects, and resources, dedicated towards forms of development that don't even register as shiny new products and things like that, which is how capitalism treats development. But so yeah, I think that it would likely be very different. Something I really like is I've been reading a lot of Amadeo Bordiga, who is useful because his way of thinking about communism is so radically different, and it shines such a different light on the planning literature. But a point that he makes is that if, as many planners say, that there would be no discounting of time preference, right? That there would be, no discounting of wealth, so that the value of something for future generations would be treated the same as today. That we would be much, much, much more conservative with fixed capital, right? And that capitalism requires us to waste fixed capital and infrastructure, right? Because producers have to run the machines faster in order to get as much stuff out of it. But in fact, the dynamics of a future society would almost be like kind of worshiping fixed capital, like the Roman aqueducts that last for thousands of years, in a way of just treating these things as these incredible kind of organic parts of our society. So I think that would just lead to a very different, attitude if we really saw how valuable these things are, and didn't discount the future and sort of ravage the planet. Our whole idea of what is valuable and what isn't would just transform so much.
And this kind of hints towards something that you briefly mentioned, which is the question of laws of motion. And you said that what Saros describes are not really like fundamentally different laws of motions, which kind of implies that you have something different in mind. And I'm absolutely in favor, I have to say, of a maximalist approach with regard to the question of planning and political economy, meaning that I believe we need to aim for the development of fundamentally different types of laws of motion. I really, really liked your article, I have to say, in its sharp critique towards centralized planned economies. But when you get to the end, more or less painting a picture of what a planarchy could look like, you do not really try to describe the fundamentals of these new or different types of laws of motion. And I'm not sure whether this is an ongoing project or if this is inherent in your radically procedural idea of how a transformation would come about and what actually a conception of communism would look like.
It is that, and it is the impossibility of describing communism as a state rather than a process. And I think that, communism, and as I imagine it, will appear from the very first moment of the revolution. It will spread by creating itself, but it will still nonetheless need to go through a period of transition where it stabilizes. So revolution immediately produces some form of communist production by, say, making wage labor voluntary and organizing things on the basis of free association. But that process has to stabilize. It has to spread. It has to strengthen itself and become resilient. And so what communism looks like in the beginning, in year 10, is probably nothing like it looks like in year 100. And I can say almost nothing about year 100 because I don't actually think that there are any laws of motion for communism. I think that this is where actually I would critique Marx, who thinks that there is a kind of transhistorical law of motion. And in many places, he indicates that labor-saving innovation and reduction of time and the reduction of what he calls the realm of necessity to open up the realm of freedom will be the sort of basis of historical development after capitalism. And I just don't think that's true. And I think that that's only one of many goods that people might choose to sort of spend less time. But I think the value that people place in their activity will mean that it will almost be impossible to tell whether something is labor saving or not, and even to distinguish between what is necessary and what is free. So I don't think that one can develop a law of motion as one has a law of motion for capitalism. I think that when we think of this as the true beginning of history, it means that there are actually thousands, if not millions, of possible paths humanity might take on the basis of those fundamental principles. And it's not really necessary for us to determine which of those is taken, only to kind of set us on that road. And for me, that's what's actually incredibly moving about the concept of communism, is that I have no idea, and that's because we inherit certain kinds of technological and social and natural conditions, and the communism that emerges, this decade is going to be very different than the one that could have emerged, 40 years ago, if we think it could have. And there's not just one. If we really think of it as, if we're really materialists and we really think of it as emerging from particular historical conditions, then it's going to have particular character, and then it will open up onto a horizon that's, in some sense, probably largely undetermined. I mean, will people, and which has to do with questions of human nature, will humans want to go to the stars? Will they just, forget language and become, who knows? It's really hard to say, right? We'd have to know what humans are, and we can't really know that until we produce a society that's based on their, cultivation and development in harmony with all other life.
Oh, that's so super hard for me, because I'm absolutely split between loving the idea because of its openness, because of its kind of inherent optimism in the sense of deep affection for humans as such, I'd say. But also there's a part in me which thinks that there has to be a somewhat pragmatic approach towards it as well, not in the sense of like limiting these types of imaginations, but making them plausible for a larger number of people. And this is not only done on the level of affection, it is at the end, I would agree it is mostly, but there's also a different layer to it, where if you want to have like large masses of people join in this idea of a super emphatic proceduralism, then you would have to address a different layer within them as well. And it is a layer that has a need for some sort of existential security as well. And if you do dismiss this, then I think the counter argument is kind of valid, that it does not recognize the people that you want to persuade in all of the complexity, which includes the anxieties of our societies today, the need for existential security, because it's a very, very strong leap into the open that you argue for, and I love it. But it's a lot to ask.
Absolutely, and we need to understand why people don't make that leap, and the kind of fears that they have, and the reasons why they never would, on the basis of ideas or persuasion or hope. And I agree. People want security. Revolutions often fail because people value their own security above all else, and they're willing to accept whatever consequences for the return of that. And so any conception of revolution really has to be able to think something about revolutionary motives. But I also think that revolution won't be a matter of persuasion, in the sense that we're, convincing people to do something and then they do it. That's not how revolution comes about. And people who don't know they're making communism can nonetheless make it. So when it comes to talking about giving people security, I think we're not talking about persuading them to think one thing. We're talking about producing conditions that people will actually fight for, that improve their lives. And, real security that would be the basis and that can't be dispossessed. And that then, becomes the basis on which they make communism, not we persuade them into doing it. And so that's, I think, just a very different way of conceiving of, and I think the persuasion is a part of it now for us as writers, in a sense, and that's not, and as people within the communist movement, but what we're doing now is, of course, very different than the kind of practical work that will be a matter of pragmatics, of course, and trial and error, and the criticism of history itself. And it will be very, and we don't have to figure it all out now. What we can do, I think, is, begin to think about what it looks like and think of it in material terms. And so I've tried to be more, I think I'm trying to be very practical in the way that I'm trying to talk very specifically about what it would look like, but it's hard under the conditions I've set myself. And I often feel like, I should put a bag over my head because I talk about communism with such incredible earnestness. I'm willing to embarrass myself to try to, share some sense that it's possible with people, which is, which I believe. And I do think that is important, and we need a positive vision. At the same time, I don't think that we can give people a blueprint. And I also don't know that a blueprint itself would be what's most convincing, right? I don't think that, Saros, for all its merits, I don't know, it's not going to convince it. Well, maybe it will, but it convinces a particular kind of person, who may be important, but certainly not the center of who you would need to convince. Right? Maybe get some engineers on our side. It's important.
Yeah, they are super important, I think. Super duper important.
Yeah, we need the engineers. That's true.
I mean, you touched upon it multiple times within the interview already, but maybe you could share your thoughts on this question of transformation a bit more. You talk about revolution. What is it that you mean with revolution, actually?
Well, I simply can't imagine any meaningful move away from capitalism happening except in a moment of the breakdown of capitalist social relations. And that could be introduced by, direct class struggle or by something else, but it would have to become an active interruption of capitalist reproduction by people trying to produce something else. And of course, the only people who would do that in any massive numbers are the people who've been dispossessed by capitalism. It's certainly not going to happen from the people who stand to benefit from the current system. So that's how I imagine revolution, is the great majority, taking control of their own lives in a condition where capitalist reproduction is interrupted. It's hard to imagine it happening in some other situation. But sometimes, progressions of capitalism through struggle can introduce that kind of interruption. There are many types of interruption, crisis. But revolution always emerges as a consequence of crisis in some way. And so that's the opening that millions of people will or won't seize. And I think that's the only basis on which we could hope for a real transformation of society. All of the organizational things that people do within capitalism don't seem to move it, and actually end up often being kind of stabilizing for it. The good news is that there are lots of crises, and things are getting, worse for capitalism. And so, it looks like we may get some chances.
And this would be like a violent upheaval in some sort?
I don't know. I don't think it necessarily has to be violent. I think that it's hard to imagine there wouldn't necessarily be violence involved, but it doesn't necessarily have to be punctual. Insurrection is probably the basis on which revolution would happen, but insurrection is not revolution itself. And revolutions can be kind of protracted. They can involve periods of struggle. It's hard to imagine that violence won't be a part of it. Unfortunately, violence and class struggle are just part of it, are together. But I think that, many of the ways that we conceive of revolution as a kind of war of class against class is probably no longer applicable. And the mechanisms of violence are so strong right now, that it's revolution as total war is sort of unimaginable. At the same time, one will not overcome the power of the state and the police, probably through words.
Well, no, not through words, but I do kind of favor a conception of revolution that is not so much tied to this like one decisive moment of upheaval or insurrection, but that kind of conceptualizes it a bit more procedural, actually. And I'm quite surprised, actually, that while you argue for a procedural type of thinking so much with regard to how you would conceive of communism as such, that you still attach yourself to this like clear-cut, I mean, I'm of course being kind of a bit polemic, but kind of a clear-cut moment of insurrection or upheaval, because I always had the feeling as if this produces a grain of violence within the revolution as such that then kind of sours its core, so to speak, and that an idea of revolution as procedure is more attractive to me. I'm not able to put together my thoughts in English about this sufficiently, I think, but one of my guests, Eva von Redeker, she wrote a book about it where she talks about revolution as a interstitielle metalepsis, is what she calls it, where you like point towards these already like futural modes of alternative belonging and practice that is already being practiced in the rooms in between, and that those need to be fostered somehow and brought to a point where you make this the dominant paradigm as such. So this is, I mean, very crudely described by me, a type of procedural thinking about revolution as such, which I think would be quite compatible with your idea of a procedural communism, actually.
I do think it's a procedure. I do think that it moves and requires moments of positivity. It's not simply about blowing things up and shooting and destroying the state. The revolution, that's why I say communism is produced immediately. It's these kinds of positive acts of producing forms of kind of free association, people producing communism within the revolution, which is a positive thing and has to do with the positive forms of life that they're making. That's how it succeeds, not by winning the war. And if violence is a part of it, then sure. But it's not, most conceptions of revolution are sort of imagining, first we defeat the state and we keep all of this kind of economic machinery in place, and then we'll change that. I think that's wrong. You defeat the state by undoing the very base, the very infrastructure of capitalism. And so I agree. It is positive, and it's likely to be protracted and not, something that happens in a single period. And also the thing that needs to be said is any revolution we've seen emerges from a crisis, and there's an insurrection, various parties are in power. There's a kind of splitting there's a kind of bifurcation of power. So it's not going to be one thing. Of course, there will be moments of interregnum where, various people try to restore class society in various kinds of forms, and other people are trying to push it forward. That's in fact what we can expect. And it's in that situation of kind of partial revolution that these questions will really be pertinent. And it is absolutely about producing kind of positivity in that moment, that it's not simply about going around and shooting all the capitalists or that. But also those things will happen too, because that's the kind of nature of sort of class struggle. So, but you can't win by that alone. And so, yeah, I mean, once you start to think about these things as, in some sense, out of anyone's control, it begins to look pretty different. So, I think that there's much to be said for this, vision of it as a protracted process. At the same time, we don't see within capitalism the emergence of any of these new forms of life that are actually leading, in terms, if we talk about laws of motion, that lead towards that. They lead back into capitalism always and every time. And the only instances of something promising that I can find are in these moments of insurrection or rupture, whether it's Italy in the 70s or Argentina or, Spanish Civil War. It's hard to imagine it happening. But that doesn't mean that it's going to look like it did in the past.
That's interesting. I'm quite sure that this is a question of how you look at it. I think that the temporality is something that might be of importance here, because I guess if you think of revolution as a more procedural type of thing, then the idea that communism will come into being immediately within the revolution is already a temporality that is wrong, in the sense of it will have to already have existed at this moment, and unless this wasn't the case, then it won't be able to come about. I think that's the different temporality, that the communism that will come about is already here, but only like in part. So I'm quite sure that this decisive break kind of idea doesn't really work, because this reminds me actually of the approach that Saros puts forward with this kind of nudging and mechanism design type of thinking. This is also an idea where the other is coming into society like from the outside, and it will have to rely on nudging and stuff like that in order to work, because people are kind of not yet ready. And we both disagree with this kind of notion. But I'm wondering how this idea of revolution, that is this kind of clear-cut type of thing, isn't more or less duplicating this type of externality within a certain type of temporality when thinking about revolution, actually.
Well, I don't think it does, but I think one would require a conception of the communist measure or the communist act that could produce communism as action, and one would have to imagine who would do that, but I think it's fairly easy to imagine self-organizing groups of proletarians producing communism for their own benefit, and then it also then benefiting others who then continue to produce it, and it reproduces itself. So the idea is that there's a kind of concatenation of communist measures and communist acts that kind of link together. And a few of them on their own wouldn't produce communism, but if you link them together enough in the process of revolution, you get something that looks like communism appearing. And in that sense, it makes sense to say it as emerging immediately, but nonetheless still being transitional. So that's sort of how I conceive of it. And of course, I conceive of it emerging in a situation where the debates we're having right now are appearing in some transformed form. And, it's to say that class society is broken down and its future is uncertain, and various parties are trying to shape the way it goes. And so there will be people trying different kinds of things. But that's the context in which I imagine this process of communization occurring, as a sort of revolution within a revolution in a moment of uncertainty. And so, that could be protracted. It could be, there's all kinds of ways that it might look nothing like what we've seen in the past. But nonetheless, I think that's the only basis on which one can imagine getting out of this terrible bind we're in.
But what's the time scale then? Because I mean, I feel it's much easier to agree with this generosity that you give, towards towards the process as well. If I think of, all right, okay, in the time scale of like maybe thousands of years or hundreds of years, like 800 years, okay, maybe, yeah. But
well, I mean, look at what's happening. Look at what's coming. I think we're going to see a massive.
Do we have 800 years?
Incredible crisis that we don't have 100 years.
Yeah,
we have in 10 years. We are going to begin to see consequences that capitalism cannot address, cannot ameliorate and mitigate, and I don't know what that is going to produce, but we don't have 80 years. And I think that things are going to look very different in 15 years. I mean, I could be completely wrong, but my guess is that capitalism has no way of addressing this. And, I think that people will realize that a total transformation of the system is the only way to protect their basic dignity and life and health, and that various, attempts to reckon with that will be made. That's my hope, and it's already, already we see, and this is why I think, just looking at the past 10 years, where have we seen class struggle? Where that's hopeful or emancipatory? It's almost always emerged in response to some crisis, right? And we think about the wave around, the wave of struggle from 2010 to 2012. It had a marked relationship to the 2008 crisis. The George Floyd uprising in the United States clearly emerges from a particular kind of crisis condition. The Gilets Jaunes movement articulates itself in relationship to a particular kind of crisis. And so, and that's just the beginning of these like gas price riots all over the world. So I just think that we have plenty of confirmation that that's where class struggle comes from in a loose and undetermined way. And these crises are converging. And of course, in response to that, people like you are having conversations about what kinds of reforms can we make now? What can we do now? Does it have to be a revolution? That doesn't make sense. And people are organizing and beginning to kind of engage in class struggle. All of that is part of it, right? You can't separate these punctual moments of class struggle from, all of the conversations that are happening, and all the different other kinds of forms of struggle. So, that's I think the horizon. I don't know. I don't know if it's hopeful. I mean, it's the only story I believe in.
Yeah.
Like, I wish we had an easier way. I wish we could just, write a bunch of smart articles and then everybody would do stuff differently, or just, have a conversation and agree on the obvious way to do things and then just do it,
That's definitely not going to work, because of what you rightly pointed out, is that it's not us telling the others how to do it, but there needs to be a different practice. Right. But I'm not sure if this different practice is brought about through the specific types of revolutionary processes that you describe, because they are also a very, very, very smart way for the powers to be to learn very effectively, the way that the like central banks and the players that needed to respond within the pandemic in the Western world, in the way in which they were able to get back to a certain type of knowledge that they accumulated after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. This was a really, really quick moment of reaction within systemic players that could utilize this knowledge. And so there is a process of learning from these crises and adapting to them. And I mean, if you look at the way the central banks is making politics, this does not match any form of neoliberalism that you could get out of any book. It just doesn't fit. It's already something different, and it already transformed like essential modes of governing, and this is kind of super frightening, because it points towards a very high degree of adaptability.
Absolutely, I agree, and I pay attention to these developments with great interest and great surprise and alarm. And I must say that I didn't really believe in those, that state had such capacities 10 years ago, when I was much more pessimistic about its intervention. So yeah, we have to really learn from these things. And of course, yeah, crises often just make capital stronger. Nonetheless, this is the only place where I see class struggle that could be the basis for this. I see people trying to make their own lives, engaging in free, transparent activity on the basis of equality. That's the only place I've ever seen it in the world, is in these moments of struggle. I don't, because everywhere else is just foreclosed by the commodity form, or various kinds of divisions, and I just think that's our hope, is to kind of expand those moments. I don't even know if I could say it's likely, but I think that it's, I don't know. Everything else looks horrible. That's all I can say.
And what would you say, how big of a crisis are we heading towards? Because you seem to think that this is kind of a precondition. How would you analyze the current state of affairs in that regard?
Well, I think that crisis is both punctual and ongoing, and there's different kinds of crises. There's kind of ongoing crisis of capitalism that we can date as going back to the 70s, or we could date it going back to 2008. But there's kind of protracted crisis, and that is already producing forms of class struggle that we can see. And then there's these kind of punctual crises, for instance, as we've just passed through. And so what will promote the destabilization is most likely to emerge from kind of overlapping crises, and so everything I can see just points to the intensification of these crises that emerge from fundamental contradictions of capitalism, but also a huge environmental crisis is about to descend upon us, is already descending upon us. And I have no idea what the forms of class struggle might emerge. And in the context of that, remains a very much an open question. But I remain quite certain that it will produce forms of class struggle. So I think that I guess I would say that my sense is that there's some possible convergence of these crises in various places that might be the opening for a transition away from capitalism and class society.
I again and again within this conversation have to say I'm split in between, because I have some kind of feeling that crisis is on the side of capital, and that this like sentence or this phrase of "never let a good crisis go to waste" very much encapsulates a specific mode of power that relies on crisis and the ongoing crisis that you speak of. And I'm not sure whether this will lead us to what you hope for, maybe. And on the other hand, I absolutely like the kind of optimism that lies within your notion as well. And maybe we should build on this for the last question that I always ask my guests, which is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Well, my joyous thought is the thought of revolution, thought of some prospect for communism opening up on the planet. And I don't know where it will first open. and it seems unlikely that I'll be a part of it or be there, but that's not what matters. And if I get to, I mean, the greatest moments in my life, I've definitely been, being able to participate and struggle in various ways. So, but that's not the important part. The important part is that it happens. So, yeah, the future looks grim. Otherwise, I really hope that, I actually believe that class struggle always kind of surprises everyone. So, I think we'll see something. I don't know what it'll be.
Jasper, thanks a lot for taking the time and being part of Future Histories.
Thank you.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon, or you can just simply tell a friend that you heard of the show and that he or she might like it as well. Have a good time and hear you in 2 weeks.